Welcome to this explainer. Today we're bypassing the usual administrative introductions and diving straight into a profound, honestly quite counterintuitive reality about systemic fragility. We aren't going to look at those simplistic history book cliches of empires suddenly falling to dramatic ruin. Instead, we're looking at the deep underlying mechanics of survival. What we're really talking about here is the actual blueprint for how human systems endure the relentless pressures of time.
Let's start with a rather sobering truth. Civilizations do not fall when the ruins appear. They fall much, much earlier. Picture a magnificent, sprawling network of interlocking roads, glowing megacities, vast electrical grids, and highly automated shipping ports. From above, it looks staggeringly powerful, right? Almost indestructible. But the reality is that failure begins quietly. It starts when the global shipping lanes are fully loaded, when data centers are humming with uninterrupted power, when institutions are still holding their daily meetings, and when official economic reports sound entirely confident.
You see, we constantly make the mistake of assuming the final, dramatic break, a regional blackout, a sudden market crash, a breached physical wall, is the collapse itself. But that visible collapse, that is incredibly late in the process. The real failure, the actual mechanical breakdown of a society, begins far earlier. A civilization doesn't collapse when the ruins finally appear. It collapses when its underlying recovery systems can no longer outpace its accumulating stress. It collapses when recovery can no longer catch the debt. Think of a power grid just flickering briefly during a winter storm, or a vital supply shipment delayed by just one single day. Those micro-failures, those are the true, hidden early warning signs.
We routinely make a fundamental mistake in how we view the world around us. We tend to define a civilization by its illusions of power, its heavily guarded borders as a sovereign country, the sheer size of its GDP, or its grand cultural monuments. But the mechanical reality is far more demanding than that. A civilization is actually a rigorous structural framework. At its core, it is what we call a persistence system.
So let's define exactly what that means. A persistent system is a vast, integrated architecture for holding useful order across time. Just to simply survive, this system has to constantly route massive amounts of energy, move millions of tons of food, repair decaying physical infrastructure, preserve complex knowledge, and coordinate millions of strangers. It is an exhausting, monumental daily endeavor. Consider this. In most modern developed nations, an overwhelming percentage of public infrastructure budgets is spent strictly on maintenance, just keeping rust and decay at bay. This system has to resolve disputes and recover from inevitable disturbances before structural damage has a chance to compound. It's essentially a machine designed entirely to ensure tomorrow is less fragile than yesterday.
And that brings us to a crucial distinction. Civilization is not power. Civilization is organized recovery. Raw military strength, vast accumulated wealth, dazzling technical complexity, honestly, they mean absolutely nothing if the underlying architecture loses its fundamental capacity to heal itself. You can possess the most advanced technology on Earth, but if you cannot repair the grid that powers it, the whole system ultimately fails.
This underlying architecture acts as the true engine of human progress. Systems rise not by magic or some kind of historical destiny, but by discovering better, highly efficient routes to process these essential elements. A society advances when it transitions from hauling water by hand to engineering sweeping aqueducts, or from sending physical letters on horseback to laying fiber optic cables across ocean floors. They find better ways to hold and store energy. They build more resilient roads. They figure out how to reliably transmit knowledge across generations, turn volatile human conflict into predictable law, and dramatically lower the coordination costs needed to maintain baseline public trust.
Which leads us to a beautifully simple equation. Growth is not the miracle here. The true miracle of any lasting society is its sheer speed and efficiency in closing those recovery loops. A civilization rises when it can recover more order than disturbance destroys. As long as that equation stays positive, as long as the repair significantly outpaces the decay, the society thrives.
Now, for those of you who've been following our deep dives into General Emergence Mechanics, you're going to immediately recognize this pattern. Across all our previous analyses, this exact same pattern of hidden debt has appeared at every single scale of reality. A road fails long before it physically cracks. A body fails when its internal recovery can't catch up to an illness. Energy systems waste what they can't hold. And artificial intelligence drifts when it loses its structural thread. Institutions collapse the precise moment their feedback loops stop correcting bad behavior, and democracies become dangerously fragile, fracturing the very second they lose their shared map of reality.
And that brings us to the ultimate macro level. Civilization is the final ledger where every unrecovered system sends its bill. It acts as the ultimate sponge, absorbing the structural debts of every broken road, every delayed institution, and every fractured piece of public trust. When those microsystems fail to recover, the debt rolls uphill. It accumulates relentlessly, and eventually civilization itself has to pay the price.
But here is where it gets highly deceptive. Civilizations often look incredibly strong just before their recovery routes fail. They project a powerful illusion of false strength. The skylines are shiny and towering, even though they're often built directly over failing, century-old subway systems and aging water pipes. The political speeches are remarkably confident, promising absolute control. The global markets open up busy every single morning, and the technical complexity of daily life is just staggering. A civilization can look profoundly powerful while quietly becoming entirely unable to repair itself.
The math behind this deception is deeply alarming. Notice how the fundamental system load shifts over time. We accumulate this massive, swelling demand for hidden maintenance debt. We pay a growing, suffocating cost just for basic coordination, and left at the very end is a tiny, shrinking sliver of actual recovery capacity. This is the dangerous trap of unmanageable complexity, completely swallowing our remaining ability to repair our own systems.
Beneath that brilliant gold facade of progress, a creeping amber ledger of hidden cascading debts is actively accumulating. These are the silent killers of a persistent system. We're talking about compounding maintenance backlogs, much like a house where a small, ignored leaky roof eventually rots away the entire structural foundation. Severe energy bottlenecks, fragile supply chains where a single-block shipping canal can halt global trade for weeks, chronic institutional delays, broken feedback loops, and ultimately, perhaps the most dangerous of all, trust erosion and deep public exhaustion. The daily dependencies simply outpace our repair speed.
This highlights a core mechanical truth that we so often ignore in modern society. Growth becomes dangerous when it expands complexity faster than recovery. We generally treat all growth as inherently good, right? But think of how deeply interconnected our modern supply chains are. Every single new dependency we build adds a severe coordination cost. If we add complexity without aggressively adding the capacity to repair that complexity, well, unchecked growth fundamentally transforms into systemic fragility.
Which brings us to the ultimate terrifying threshold. Civilizations fall when collapse becomes cheaper than repair. Systems can survive enormous shocks, natural disasters, and even global conflicts, as long as their core recovery capacity remains intact. But the exact moment repairing the system becomes too expensive, too incredibly slow, too politically costly, or just too deeply distrusted by an exhausted public, the system gives way. Collapse simply becomes the path of least resistance.
So, how do we know exactly where we stand today? Well, to measure our true health, we have to rigorously ask these diagnostic questions to see if our society still functions as a coherent, persistent system. Can our system actually hear bad news without suppressing it? Can it efficiently repair what breaks, from physical bridges to our social contracts? Can it update its shared map in the face of a rapidly changing reality? Can it distribute the staggering costs of living fairly enough to preserve baseline public trust? And crucially, can it willingly choose the hard, unglamorous work of recovery over the terrible ease of collapse?
The takeaway here is profound. The measure of civilization is not what it can build, it is what it can keep coherent. Civilizations do not survive merely because they are remarkably large, unbelievably rich, or incredibly old. They survive only as long as they maintain this coherent, integrated capacity to recover from the relentless shocks of reality.
But here is the hopeful pivot. This shouldn't leave us in despair at all, because civilization is an engineered system, and a clear diagnosis means the route out is visible. If failure starts long before the visible break, then it stands to reason that recovery can start long before the collapse. Early diagnosis gives us the exact structural blueprint needed to start early repair, to fix the broken feedback loops, and to lower the coordination costs before the mounting debt overwhelms us.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought as we look ahead to our own ledger. Are we currently watching civilization fail, or are we learning finally how recovery must actually be built? The underlying mechanics are laid completely bare in front of us. It is entirely up to us to decide which path we are actively choosing. Thank you for joining me for this explainer into the architecture of persistence.